It's been a wonderful day, albeit a shortened one. As Lynn mentioned, my flight from New York last night was delayed by 2 hours, causing me to miss my connection in Chicago. So I unfortunately had to cancel my meetings with people this morning, but I'm hoping that we can reschedule meetings with grad students and postdocs and anybody else, or catch up tonight if that's not possible for tomorrow morning. But it's been a wonderful day. I'm originally from the Midwest, from Cincinnati, but I've been living in New York for 13, 14 years, something like that. So it's good to be back in the Midwest. I think I've encountered more nice people on a percentage basis today than I have in a very long time. So it's been fun. This is my first official visit to the University of Missouri. It's a great honor to be part of this prestigious speaker series. There's great people on that list, and the next speaker is actually somebody I went to graduate school with, Jack Glazer. We're old buddies too, but these are tremendous speakers. So I'm very flattered and honored and gratified that you invited me. So thank you very much for that. I was 24 years ago, I was in Columbia. I ate at Shakespeare's Pizza, and I loved it and had very positive impressions about Columbia, and have been looking forward to coming back. I even still have a T-shirt of Shakespeare's Pizza from their 10th anniversary year, which was 1993. So I still have the T-shirt. I don't know if it's worth something here, but make me an offer if it is. What I would like to do today is to give you a kind of overview of research that is based on this theoretical perspective that, as Christy mentioned, I've been working on since I was a graduate student, about 25 years, since my last visit to Shakespeare's Pizza, and since I was an eager PhD student, like a lot of you are in the room. For me, this whole enterprise started with a set of questions that came to me as I took courses not only in social psychology, but also in clinical psychology and cognitive psychology and developmental psychology, and also in sociology and political science and philosophy. And I began to ask myself things like this. Why do women feel that they're entitled to lower salaries than men? Why do people stay in abusive relationships? And why do African American children come to think that white dolls are more attractive and desirable? Why do people blame victims of injustice, and why do victims of injustice sometimes blame themselves? Why is it so difficult to get people to stand up for themselves, and why do we find personal and social change to be so challenging, even painful at times? So is there a common denominator here? That's what I wanted to know. And these questions are still very much with me, and I'd like to share them with you today, even if I still don't have all the answers. There are also some related questions that just keep coming up about political economy, such as, why do poor people often oppose the redistribution of wealth? Why do we tolerate political and economic corruption? And where's the outrage, even after a series of worldwide financial crises and meltdowns? I know that this year the focus of your series is on inequality, so I'm going to say a few things about economic inequality and then tie it back to system justification theory. There are many different ways of looking at income inequality, but they all tell pretty much the same story. Over the last 30 years, in the United States and many other capitalist nations, the rich have gotten much richer, and the middle and working classes have either stayed the same or gotten worse. In the United States, one of the richest countries in the history of the world, over 45 million citizens, that's 14.5% of the population, live below the official poverty line. And so actual poverty rates are probably even higher than that. Nearly 1/4 of African Americans and Latinos live in poverty in the United States. And at the same time, the combined net worth of the 400 wealthiest Americans exceeds $1.4 trillion, with CEOs today earning approximately 300 times the salary of their average employee, which is up from a factor of 85 back in the mid-1990s. So over a 30-year period, the inflation-adjusted hourly wage in the US declined by more than 7%, and yet the share of total income going to the top 1% nearly tripled during that same time period. And the problem is even more acute, it seems, in Missouri than in most other US states. I don't mean to suggest that economic inequality is a simple problem with a simple solution. Obviously, it's not. But I do think that psychology has a critical role to play if we are ever to make significant progress in solving problems like this. Most theories in social science, including theories of relative deprivation, moral outrage, self-interest, motivation, identity politics, collective action, and revolution, all propose that people should object, perhaps even violently, to stark forms of inequality, especially increasing inequality. And certainly some people, including those who took part in the Occupy Wall Street or Indignados movements, do object to the degree of economic inequality in our societies. But it's not the modal response. In general, it seems that people do not protest as often or as intensely as common sense, which assumes a norm of self-interest, and prevailing theories in social science would predict or expect. And sometimes when they do protest against something, it's not clear that they're protesting against the actual source of their frustrations. So in addition to knowing why men rebel, as Ted Gurr famously put it in the early 1970s, we also need to know why men and women do not rebel. And so it was really to address this gap or oversight in the literature that Mahzarin Banaji, another mentor of mine along with Bill McGuire, Mahzarin and I sought to develop a system justification perspective that would help to explain why most people, including the disadvantaged, typically accept the social system as more or less legitimate, and why the disadvantaged sometimes, not always, sometimes, participate in their own subjugation. More specifically, we argued that previous lines of research in social psychology had made a good case for two well-known classes of defensive motivation, namely tendencies to defend, bolster, and rationalize the interests and esteem of the self and the in-group. Okay, so for instance, most, but not all of us want to believe that we are better drivers than the average person, and also more fair, too. And most, but not all of us, want to believe that our school teams, or that our schools or sports teams or work organizations, our companies are better than their rivals and competitors. And these are well-known motives in social psychology. We know a lot about ego-defensive motives and phenomena such as in-group favoritism. And so I like to refer to these two classes of motivation as ego justification and group justification, respectively. But Mahzarin and I wondered whether there might be a third form of defensive motivation. Is there also a system justification motivation in which people defend, bolster, and rationalize the interests and esteem or the legitimacy of the social systems that affect them? And these social systems, we think, can range in terms of size and scope from dyadic relationships, couple relationships, to families. Families are social systems too, to hierarchical institutions and arrangements, to work and other organizations, and even entire societies or nations. Could system justification motivation help to explain self-defeating and group-defeating behaviors, and can it also shed light on the psychological appeal of conservative ideas, that is, ideas that are favorable to the status quo, whether or not those ideas are also favorable to the self-concept and the specific social groups to which one belongs. So my students and collaborators and I have been pretty busy these last 15, 20 years, and we've done a lot of work on this theory, and I want to summarize for you at least some of what we've come up with so far, which is, again, not to say that we've solved everything by any means. I don't think we have. But there are really 5 major tenets or postulates of system justification theory. And I've already alluded to the first one and the most basic one, namely that people are motivated, often at a non-conscious level of awareness, to defend, justify, and bolster aspects of the status quo, including existing social, economic, and political systems, institutions, and arrangements. At the same time, we are not saying that people always or invariably perceive the status quo as completely fair and just. As with all other motives in psychology, system justification is expected to vary considerably across individuals, groups, and situations. So the second postulate is that the strength of system justification motivation and its expression vary according to situational and dispositional factors. Okay, so individual differences and contextual differences. Through empirical work, we have discovered a number of contextual or situational moderators. We might think of these things as triggers of a system justification response. So for instance, we found that system justification motivation is activated or increased when the system is criticized, challenged, or threatened. And I think that there are a lot of real-world examples of system defensiveness or backlash against people and events that challenge the status quo. Some of you may have heard about a football player, Colin Kaepernick, and his public decision not to stand with his hand on his heart during the playing of the national anthem last season. He stated publicly, for instance, that I'm not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color. Okay. From a system justification perspective, it is far from surprising that Kaepernick faced massive backlash, not just disagreement, mind you, but strongly motivated, widespread, passionate forms of attack and derision. My colleagues and I have identified at least 28 experiments published between 2005 and 2014, demonstrating that exposure to system criticism or threat can produce a number of effects on a wide range of system justifying outcomes or dependent variables. And Bonnie Price is going to produce experiments 29 and 30 in this list, I just learned today. And some of these dependent variables or outcomes include increased preferences for domestic over international consumer products, increased stereotyping of advantaged groups as competent and agentic, and disadvantaged groups as communal. We refer to this as complementary stereotypic differentiation, and we think that it kind of creates an illusion of equality within the social system so that every group has sort of some pluses and some minuses in a sense. Male commitment to traditional relationships and attraction to women who embody the ideals of benevolent sexism. Backlash against feminists and women who defy gender stereotypes, such as in the area of leadership. And increased tolerance for civilian casualties during war, and decreased support for hate crimes policies among people who are chronically high in system justification. All right. There are other moderators that we and other members of the research community have identified as well. And I don't have time to go into too much detail about the first two. But Kristen Lauren and her colleagues have shown that people are much more accepting of unwelcome outcomes, such as restrictions on their freedoms or various forms of inequality, when these are perceived as part of a status quo that is inevitable or inescapable. There's no alternative to it. And John Blanchard and Scott Eidelman, again, Molly's advisor from undergraduate school, that's my last reference to Molly Price during this talk, have found that people are more supportive of the caste system in India and the capitalist system in the United States and the UK when they're made to feel that these systems are older and more long-standing and traditional, as opposed to fairly recent in human history. And in collaboration with a former student of mine, Joanneke van der Toorn, who's now a faculty member in the Netherlands, and others, we've also found that feelings of powerlessness or dependence can foster system justification. So by definition, the powerless are highly dependent on others, and case studies in sociology and political science suggest that the powerless are often surprisingly uninterested in challenging the status quo. And so John Gaventa, for instance, a political scientist, conducted an in-depth study of Appalachian coal miners in the US, and he concluded that a sense of powerlessness was instilled, which could lead to an introjection of the values of the controller or a loyalty to the power holders. And we wanted to investigate this possibility more directly. And so in a series of studies, we looked at this in a few different ways. The first one you might think of as sort of office politics. Through Tom Tyler, we had access to a nationally representative sample of over 1,500 employees who had had the same supervisor for at least 1 year. And we found that feelings of financial dependence on one's job were indeed positively associated with the perceived legitimacy of one's supervisor, even after adjusting for procedural treatment and outcome favorability. So trying to adjust for the goodies and even the fair treatment actually received by the boss, holding all those things constant, feeling financially dependent, made people feel that the boss was more legitimate. In a second study, we had access to a fairly large sample of undergraduate students at the University of California at Berkeley through Rob Willer and Matt Feinberg. And we found that students with backgrounds that were lower in terms of socioeconomic status tended to score lower on a scale used to measure generalized sense of power. And that those who scored lower on this generalized sense of power tended to score higher on economic system justification, which includes these items. If people work hard, they almost always get what they want. Economic positions are legitimate reflections of people's achievements. Most people who don't get ahead in our society should not blame the system. They have only themselves to blame. It is unfair to have an economic system which produces extreme wealth and extreme poverty at the same time. That's a reverse scored item. So disagreement with this item would make you higher on economic system justification. And social class differences reflect differences in the natural order of things. So this is economic system justification, and I'll come back to this at the end of my presentation because it seemed to play a role in support for Donald Trump as president as well. I'll show you some data. But in studies 3 and 4 of this research program, we experimentally manipulated the subjective sense of powerlessness. We used a paradigm developed by Adam Galinsky, in which participants are instructed to write an essay about a specific incident or event, a specific time, in which they either had power over somebody else or somebody else had power over them. And you can see here some of the kinds of examples. I hope you can see here some of the kinds of examples that college students came up with. Many of them had to do with interviewing people or being interviewed for valued positions or opportunities, work opportunities or social opportunities or other kinds of activities, even living situations and so on. To ensure that this manipulation was effective in inducing either high or low power, we had independent coders judge the essays. They didn't know whether the essays themselves had been written by someone who had been assigned to the low power or the high power condition, but they did successfully predict, in a sense, or they rated the essays written by people who had been assigned to the low power condition as reflecting more dependence and less power in compared to those essays written by people who had been assigned to the high power condition. That's the manipulation check. And in study 3, after the manipulation, we had participants complete the general system justification scale. And we found that participants who were assigned to the low power condition compared to the high power condition scored significantly higher on general system justification. which we measure with items like these. These actually are all the items from this scale. In general, you find society to be fair. In general, the American political system operates as it should. American society needs to be radically restructured. That's a reverse scored item. The US is the best country in the world to live in. Most policies serve the greater good. Everyone has a fair shot at wealth and happiness. Our society is getting worse every year. That's a reverse scored item. And society is set up so that people usually get what they deserve. In the fourth and final study from this package, we asked whether powerlessness would lead to increased system justification even when inequality within the system was made explicitly salient and a system-challenging explanation for that inequality was made cognitively available or accessible to people. And so after this manipulation of high power versus low power, the essay writing manipulation, we asked people to appraise the legitimacy or illegitimacy of racial disparities in incarceration rates, the unequal distribution of wealth in society, and the gender wage gap. Okay, so here are the materials for the legitimacy of racial inequality situation. Participants read that while African American men comprise 14% of the population of young men in the United States, they represent over 40% of the prison population. And then we gave them two reasons. And the first reason was always a system-challenging reason, and the second reason was always a system-exonerating one or an excusing one. So the first reason here we gave them was there's discrimination in society and in the criminal justice system against African Americans. And the second reason is the African American family unit has fallen apart, with the majority of African American males growing up in fatherless households and without any viable role models. And then we asked participants, okay, how much do you believe that the higher representation of African Americans in prison is due to legitimate reasons? How much do you agree that the criminal justice system treats African Americans fairly? And how much do you agree that African Americans in prison earned the prison sentences that they receive? Here's what participants saw for the legitimation of economic inequality situation. We told them that the richest 1% of the American population owns as much as the combined wealth of the bottom 90%. Here's some reasons. One reason, the market system is unfair and favors the rich to get richer. Second reason, the wealthiest families have shrewdly invested their money in real estate, financial markets, and in savings over the years, whereas most of the rest of America has not. And then we asked them, how much do you believe the distribution of wealth in America is legitimate? How much do you agree that the richest 1% have earned their place at the top? How much do you agree that the bottom 90% have earned their place below the top? And finally, the legitimation of gender inequality situation. We told people that working women's salaries are about 17% less than working men's salaries in the US, and we gave them reasons. One reason, there's discrimination against women in the workplace. Second reason, women are more likely to leave the workforce for a few years to raise and care for a family. And then we asked them, how much do you think the gap between women's and men's pay is legitimate? How much do you agree that men rightfully earn the higher pay they get? And how much do you agree that women rightfully earn the lower pay that they get? And we observed a clear and consistent effect of the power manipulation. So across the board, across all three scenarios, participants who were asked to write an essay about being powerless or dependent perceived all three types of inequality, racial, economic, and gender inequality, as more legitimate than did participants who were asked to write an essay about being high in power. Some would consider that a counterintuitive finding. The fourth postulate addresses the question of why people would engage in system justification. We propose that system justification addresses epistemic motives to reduce uncertainty, existential motives to assuage threat, and relational motives to coordinate social relationships. And in some ways, this postulate may be easier to grasp in its negative form. To truly challenge the status quo, to engage in sustained and profound forms of protest, one must be able to tolerate a great deal of uncertainty, potential threats to one's safety and security, and the risk of being alienated or cut off from friends, family members, and others in mainstream society. And so the idea really is that dispositional and situational variability in these underlying needs should affect the strength of system justification motivation. And I investigated this possibility directly in a study conducted with 3 of my former PhD students, Aaron Hennis, whom some of you may know, spent some time here on and off, Hannah Nam, and Chadley Stern. I'm thrilled to say that all 3 of them now have tenure-track faculty jobs, so, and great ones too, at Purdue, Stony Brook, and University of Illinois. So in this study, which was conducted using Amazon's Mechanical Turk, we administered items from various individual different scales of epistemic, existential, and relational motives. And we found that people who scored lower on need for cognition and higher on death anxiety and the need to share reality were more politically conservative and endorsed general and economic system justification to a stronger degree. And furthermore, they were more likely to endorse conservative positions on a wide range of issues, including issues of climate change, healthcare reform, and immigration policy. And these effects were mediated by economic system justification. And third, they were more supportive of the politically conservative Tea Party movement and less supportive of the progressive Occupy Wall Street movement. And these effects were also mediated by economic system justification. So in case you're wondering, some people do, whether conservative activists, such as supporters of the Tea Party, are high or low in terms of system justification motivation, whether they're defending the system or challenging it, my take is that the bulk of the evidence so far suggests that they're high. They're very high system justifiers. So more specifically, our studies suggested that supporters of the Tea Party were motivated to defend the American way against a perceived threat to the status quo that they saw as coming, in this case, I think ironically, from the President of the United States, Barack Obama, either because of his relatively liberal politics or the fact that he was the first African-American president, or both. So very recently, following a wonderful trip I had in the fall to Buenos Aires, I conducted a parallel study with my hosts, Edgardo Echezar and Joaquin Ungaretti, involving 373 university students in Argentina, in which we administered items designed to measure epistemic, existential, and relational motives, as well as system justification, ideology, and support for the current center-right president. We obtained results that were very similar to those we had obtained here in the US. Respondents who scored higher on the need for cognitive closure and the need to share reality, and to a non-significant extent, higher on death anxiety, also scored higher on system justification. And in this case, we estimated a latent factor based on economic system justification and belief in a just world. So they were really interested in the belief in a just world. And right-wing versus left-wing orientation. And so in addition, system justification mediated the effects of epistemic and relational motives on right-wing orientation and support for President Mauricio Macri in the most recent presidential election in Argentina, as well as rejection of the opposition, center-left opposition party, the FPV. The fifth and final postulate, or major sort of tenet or postulate of system justification theory, is that system justification serves the palliative function of making people feel better about the status quo. And so the general idea here is somewhat reminiscent of Karl Marx's oft-quoted but seldom understood notion that religious ideology is the opiate of the masses, that is, like ibuprofen, it placates and palliates. A lot of people don't realize that when he wrote that, people used opium when they were sick and tired, and things like this, and had headaches. So they didn't have ibuprofen, so they used opium, and that's sort of what he was saying. He wasn't saying religion is a hallucination. He was saying this is a way of coping, actually. In general, we do find that giving people the opportunity to justify the system leads them to report more positive affect and less negative affect, and to feel better and more satisfied with their own situation and the status quo in general. And again, this phenomenon might be easier to understand for some of you in its negative form. Perhaps over the last 5 or 6 weeks, some of you might have felt emotionally distressed, perhaps even depressed, by the worry that our government may have been doing things that you consider to be illegitimate, perhaps even corrupt in some ways, even though you're not personally responsible, and nor are the groups that you identify with. This is sort of the flip side, in some sense, of what happens when you can't believe or subscribe to the legitimacy of the system. It hurts. Okay. We found, in any case, that the personal, emotional, or hedonic benefits of system justification come with a cost in terms of decreased potential for social change and the remediation of inequality. So specifically, Cheryl Waxlack, Tom Tyler, and I found that system-justifying ideologies, whether measured or manipulated through a mindset priming technique, do indeed serve to reduce emotional distress, including negative affect in general and guilt in particular. But they also reduce moral outrage. And this is important because we know from prior research that moral outrage motivates people to engage in helping behavior and to support social change. So in one study, for instance, we found that after adjusting for baseline levels of negative affect and moral outrage, random assignment to a high system justification condition in which people are primed with rags to riches, anyone can succeed in America types of stories versus a control condition led to a reduction in negative affect in general and to a reduction in moral outrage in particular. And furthermore, this reduction in moral outrage made people feel less inclined to help the disadvantaged, measured in terms of their degree of support for and willingness to volunteer and donate to a soup kitchen or a crisis hotline, or to support tutoring and job training programs. In thinking further about the palliative function of system justification and the fact that political conservatives tend to score higher on all of the system justification scales that I've shown you, Jamie Napier, another former PhD student of mine, hypothesized that political conservatives should be happier than liberals on average. And it turns out they are. Even after adjusting for survey respondents' own income, their age, marital status, religiosity, and other demographic characteristics, we found, using data from the American National Election Studies, that conservatives scored significantly higher than liberals on measures of subjective well-being, including self-reported happiness and life satisfaction. The ideological gap in subjective well-being was statistically mediated or explained, at least in part, by the fact that conservatives were more likely to believe that inequality in society is fair and justified. We replicated these results in 9 European countries using data from the World Values Survey looking at right-left orientation. So this is by no means a purely American phenomenon. And we also hypothesized that if conservatives legitimize economic inequality more than liberals do, then their subjective well-being should be less affected by the significant increase in income inequality over the last 30 years. And so we plotted the happiness levels of liberals and conservatives against scores on the Gini index, which, as you know, is a macroeconomic indicator of income inequality. And we found that with increasing inequality was associated with decreased happiness in general, adjusting for lots of other factors, but the decrease was significantly steeper for liberals or leftists, apparently because they lack conservatives' ideological buffer against the negative psychological effects of inequality. Okay, I know I don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to say a bit about the implications of system justification theory for intergroup relations, because it's an important topic, and I think the theory does have something to contribute here. We know from perhaps a century or more of writings about ethnocentrism, at least back to William Graham Sumner, that people frequently favor their own groups. And there's some indication that this may enhance individual or collective self-esteem. And it sometimes results in subtle or not so subtle forms of prejudice, hostility, and discrimination. And these are important facts about intergroup relations. But I also think that they are facts that apply more broadly to members of advantaged groups than to disadvantaged groups. And I would say that this is because for members of high status or advantaged groups, system justification is consistent with ego and group justification motives. That is, motives to maintain or enhance individual self-esteem and group esteem. So if I'm a white man on the top of the food chain, as my wife would say, there's no conflict or contradiction in thinking that I'm great, that my group is great, and the system is great that allows all of us to succeed so marvelously, right? It all fits together. For members of advantaged groups, then, system justification should be positively associated with self-esteem, with in-group favoritism, and long-term psychological well-being. And it is, we find in our research. For members of low status or disadvantaged groups, however, system justification conflicts with ego and group justification motives. Okay? But what we're not saying then is that the disadvantaged are usually or typically more likely than the advantaged to support the status quo, which is a view that has been attributed to us, but it's not our view. On the contrary, given countervailing ego and group justification motives, I think it's remarkable that they support it to any degree at all. For members of disadvantaged groups, system justification, in other words, comes with a cost. Okay, system justification tends to be negatively associated with self-esteem, in-group favoritism, and long-term psychological well-being in terms of depression, neuroticism, anxiety, and ambivalence. System justification frequently leads members of disadvantaged groups to show out-group favoritism. That is, to hold more positive attitudes about other groups that are higher in status or power than their own group. So studies examining implicit or automatic attitudes or evaluations using the implicit association test, the IAT, and several other methods that presumably mitigate social desirability concerns, at least to some degree, reveal that sizable proportions of members of disadvantaged groups, sometimes even 50% or more, exhibit implicit biases against their own group and in favor of more advantaged outgroup members. And so, for instance, poor people tend to favor rich people on implicit association tests. Obese people favor normal weight people. Gays and lesbians favor straight people. Hispanics favor Caucasians. And dark-skinned morenos in Chile favor lighter-skinned blancos there. Black and colored children in South Africa favor whites on these measures. Black, Latino, and Asian college students favor white students. And there's field studies that show even that black and Latino passengers even tip white taxi drivers better than they tip black and Latino taxi drivers. And importantly, the magnitude of implicit outgroup favoritism among the disadvantaged is positively correlated with individual scores on measures of system justification and political conservatism, as predicted by system justification theory. Okay, finally, let's talk a little bit about support for Donald Trump. We both know you were going to ask me about it anyway. Trump's election has been interpreted by many as a revolt against the status quo. Throughout the campaign, he was widely perceived as an outsider, having never held any kind of political office before, attacking business as usual in Washington, and railing against the failed legacies of the Obama, Bush, and Clinton administrations with promises to drain the swamp. Right? Trump's most enthusiastic supporters seem to be Republicans who were furious with the government. The Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, meanwhile, was derided as the establishment candidate. Trump's running mate, Mike Pence, you might recall, once referred to her as the secretary of the status quo. And on the morning after the election, the Washington Post concluded that Donald Trump was elected the nation's 45th president in the stunning culmination of a campaign that, among other things, galvanized legions of aggrieved Americans in a loud repudiation of the status quo. Cornel West even went so far as to suggest that Trump's election signaled that economic insecurity, among other things, had brought the neoliberal global order to an end. But there's something a little bit strange, I think, about the suggestion that working class whites' dissatisfaction with capitalism pushed them into the arms of Donald Trump. Trump has long been one of the nation's most well-known capitalists, a billionaire real estate mogul who inherited much of his wealth and became especially famous as a star of reality television, right? As Garrison Keillor remarked, the disaffected white blue-collar workers elected a Fifth Avenue tycoon to rescue them from the elitists. Americans could have elected Bernie Sanders, who, as a democratic socialist, would have posed a genuine danger to the economic status quo. But instead, they chose a very famous businessman, a country club owner, a successful maven of the financial elite. So to look at the role of system justification in the 2016 presidential election, Tobias Rothmund, Flavio Azevedo, and I hired a professional survey firm to recruit a nationally representative sample of 1,500 Americans in the months leading up to the election, and to administer a variety of online questionnaires designed to measure social and political attitudes, including ideology, religiosity, and candidate preferences, along with 3 different measures of system justification. Economic system justification, I showed you items from that. General system justification, I showed you items from that. And a gender-specific measure of system justification, about the extent to which people find inequalities between men and women in society and also in the family to be legitimate and justified. Consistent with prior research, we observed that respondents who identified themselves as more conservative, more religious, and more right-wing scored higher on all 3 types of system justification. And as shown here, Republicans also scored higher on all 3 types of system justification compared to Democrats. That is, they endorsed the legitimacy of economic disparities between rich and poor, gender disparities between men and women, and the American social and political system in general. But at the level of candidate preferences, there were some interesting differences. Supporters of Jeb Bush scored very high on all 3 measures of system justification: economic, general, and gender specific. And supporters of Bernie Sanders scored very low on all 3 of those measures. Supporters of Donald Trump scored high on 2 of the 3 measures. They scored high on economic system justification and gender-specific system justification, but not very high on general system justification, whereas supporters of Hillary Clinton showed almost the reverse pattern. They scored quite low on economic system justification and gender-specific system justification, but kind of high on general system justification, especially for a Democratic sample. And these basic patterns cut across lines of social class. At every level of income, Trump supporters were significantly higher than Clinton supporters in economic and gender-specific system justification. But perhaps surprisingly, there were no differences at any income level between Trump and Clinton supporters with respect to general system justification. We also conducted a logistic regression analysis in which the three types of system justification were entered simultaneously as predictors of voting choices between Trump and Clinton. Economic and gender-specific system justification were both independently and significantly associated with an increase in the likelihood of voting for Trump over Clinton. But general system justification was associated with a significant decrease in the possibility of voting for him. And these effects persisted even after we adjusted for religiosity and various demographic variables. So to me, the results of this study, which I'm presenting now for the first time, highlight the fact that there are multiple meaningful dimensions or domains of system justification. So there's more than one sense in which someone can be accepting or rejecting of the status quo. The same person may be an enthusiastic defender of the capitalist economic system or the gendered division of labor within the family, but not the federal government or vice versa. Another implication, I think, is that many American voters seem to be frustrated by the consequences of global competition under capitalism, but are unwilling or unable, I think for psychological reasons in part, to criticize the capitalist system and the existing social and economic social order. Trump supporters clearly rejected liberal governance under President Obama, but they strongly justified traditional economic and gender-based disparities in American society. And I think we are seeing some of the ramifications of that now in terms of policy. Okay. I want to thank you for your patience and your attention. I know I've thrown a lot of material at you, but I wanted to give, especially those of you who are not familiar with system justification theory, which I think is most of you, I wanted to give people a kind of crash course on the major theoretical claims and at least some of the methods we've used to study these claims and what we've found so far. System justification theory, I think, is unique in postulating a general tendency to defend, bolster, and justify aspects of the societal status quo, again, not necessarily at a conscious level of awareness. Of course, we're not saying that people will always or exclusively engage in system justification. There are plenty of other motives that may neutralize or overcome system justification tendencies in a given situation, including maybe self-interested motives, ego justification, group justification, motives for justice, motives for innovation. People may also justify some aspects of the social system, but not others. Okay. But differences in the strength of system justification motivation, I have suggested, are linked both theoretically and empirically to situational and dispositional variability in epistemic, existential, and relational needs. That is, needs for certainty, security, and solidarity or social belongingness. I've also provided evidence that system justification is associated with legitimation of racial, gender, and economic forms of inequality, and with short-term palliative benefits in terms of subjective well-being, positive affect, and self-reported happiness, but also is associated with long-term costs, especially for members of disadvantaged groups. I've alluded to at least some of the societal implications of system justification, such as stereotyping, prejudice, intergroup relations, political ideology, and voting preferences. There are others too that I didn't have time to discuss today, such as religiosity, belief in a just God, the concept of theodicy, self-objectification among women, body shame, surveillance, self-surveillance, and things like this. Environmental inaction, motivated skepticism about climate change. If you're interested in any of those things, we have articles on those as well. And finally, in closing, although I think it's true that system justification tendencies can inspire people to celebrate and vindicate truly just institutions, including perhaps democratic norms and practices, system justification is sometimes an obstacle to the attainment of social justice because it can lead us to excuse and deny aspects of our social systems, such as the ever-widening gap between rich and poor and the damage we're doing to the natural environment, to take just two salient examples that probably should be addressed sooner rather than later. Thank you. And we have time for questions, right? Okay, great. Happy to take questions, comments, reactions, thoughts, feelings, hopes, aspirations. Yes?
So, a lot of your work, there's a lot of different samples, mostly adults. So.
Yeah.
You don't work with adolescents, and what do we see what's like in adolescence? So Erickson argued that in some ways adolescents are pushing the status quo, while the adult population is kind of counterbalanced with ultimately changing the status quo over time. So what do adolescents look like in terms of these different things that you're looking at?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I have an association, and then an answer, which is based on data, which is we made maybe 2 or 3 studies actually with adolescents, and we have found that that they also respond defensively to attacks on a system, but we tried to create social systems that were really meaningful for high school students, adolescents. So we came up with a thing about, in one of the experiments, about the high school popularity clique, right? So all of us, when we were in high school, there were, super popular, wonderful people who everybody loved and wanted to be like, and then the rest of us. And I think that that's a perfectly good example of what society is like and how there's a kind of stratified, unequal situation that most people are basically buying into, with some, resentment eking out here and there and so on. We found that if you threaten, if you take high school students and you threaten the legitimacy of the American system, if you do that, they endorse the high school popularity clique in their high school more enthusiastically. And if you threaten the legitimacy of the high school clique, then they endorse the national level of system justification strongly. So we argued that I guess there's a couple possibilities. One is that if you thwart the system justification needs in one domain, it might come back in another domain. The other possibility, I think, is that psychologically, people do have a mental representation of something like the system that might include everything from who's popular and good looking and so on, and things about the government and about business and all these kinds of things. So there may be, not very well articulated, but a representation of the system that people are defending that has all these things. But we haven't teased apart those two things. But that's a way of saying that adolescents behave much like the young adults and older adults in our studies. But there's another part of your comment that really resonates with me, which is that if you look at the history of revolutions, it's almost always young people. Not necessarily teenagers, but it's people probably, between the ages of 16, 17, and 25 have been by far, and mostly male, but not always, been the major participants in actual revolutionary movements. And I do think that there are psychological reasons in part for that do include things like there might be neurological, first of all, there might actually be neurological reasons for this, that in some sense we now know that the brain is is quite plastic, and the cerebral cortex is not fully formed until you're like 25 or something like this. So there might literally be neurological reasons why people in that age group are way more open to possible forms of society that people like me, where our cerebral cortex is set, are not able to kind of conjure up. So, but there's also a social psychological aspect, which is they're also not yet heavily invested in this society in the way that someone with a full-time job or a family to support or whatever else it is has. I think, so I think that there are social and psychological and maybe even neurological reasons for, I think, where you're going with this. And that's a more extreme version of what Erickson was talking about, obviously, with people pushing their parents for autonomy. He was mostly emphasizing autonomy strivings on the part of the adolescents to differentiate themselves from their parents. And it does connect up with the comment I made about families being a social system. And in many ways, that's one of our first social systems, our status quo. And I do think the family has that impact on us psychologically. It is the status quo. Everyone grows up thinking that whatever their family does is basically pretty normal, and doesn't everybody do it that way? And then it's much later you realize, wow, that was really unusual. Okay, yes. Yeah, second row, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That was a fantastic presentation.
Wow, thank you.
We appreciate you for coming all the way here.
Thank you.
And Shakespeare is still open, by the way.
Oh, I know, I looked it up before coming. I haven't made it there yet, but I was really happy to see it's still in business. Yeah.
So I was just looking at like some of the questions you, in some of the surveys
Yes.
that you had talked about initially. And these are surveys that looked at whether rich people might possibly be favored by the system, or why women were getting lower pay, why the 40% of African American younger men in prisons, as opposed to them considering only 14% of the U.S. population. And I'm not sure, because they say eyewitness testimony is not entirely reliable.
Yes.
So
Psychologists would agree with that, yes.
But
Yeah.
it would seem that that in each case, there's the first question provides a popular belief or understanding, and the subsequent questions appear to be suggestive in that they might actually direct a justification
Yeah.
for the status quo.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering whether that makes the survey neutral, or whether that was a glitch. Was it intended to be almost rationalizing the phenomena the social ill or phenomena we're talking about?
Yeah.
Or is it,
Yeah.
is it something
It's a
that
great
just
question.
happened by happenstance?
No, we intended that. That was only one experiment, basically, of all the ones I talked about, where we intentionally gave people first a strong anti-system statement, and then basically some material they could rationalize with if they wanted to. And that was the design, that was the idea for that experiment. It was something we tried, that was really the first time. And we haven't done much more with it, but I kind of like the idea. I mean, I'm curious if you have methodological concerns about it, but I kind of like the idea of giving people something that if they're inclined to, they can grab onto. And the fact that people were experimentally, randomly assigned, to the high power or the low power condition suggested that people were grabbing onto that rationalization more when they were in a low power position, when they were remembering a low power position, than when they were remembering a high power position.
So would you say the outcome, the survey outcomes might have been different?
Yes. No question about it.
The options have been reversed in the order.
Oh, in the order. That's interesting. There's a whole literature on question order effects in the survey literature, and it does suggest, yes, they play a significant role. Even on ballots, listing political candidates in alphabetical order gives a huge advantage to the person whose last name begins with A, B, C, whatever. The person listed on gets at least 5% of a benefit and of a bounce in voting. So they've started to consider, randomly listing people in different orders on ballots and things like this. There's no question that question order makes a difference. And I would totally, like if our whole case hinged on that one experiment, I would not feel comfortable coming to you today to talk about this research. Yeah, I think the point is very well taken, yes. Okay, yes.
I'm wondering about, or if you could talk about sort of what is the opposite of system justification? I keep
Yeah.
thinking about that some level of belief in fairness in the system is, otherwise you'd just be cynical and you wouldn't even try at all, right?
Yeah,
So if somebody's
totally.
a first generation college student or someone from a disadvantaged group, if you don't think there's any fairness, then why bother?
I totally agree.
There has to be some kind of, maybe some of this system justification is an expression of naive optimism or
Yeah.
hope that maybe it'll still work out for me.
I totally agree, and I hope you don't think I'm saying like system justification is all bad and we would all do better if we had none of it. I'm not saying that. But I hear two questions there. One is what's the opposite of system justification? And we've wrestled with that a little bit because I think there's at least two or three possibilities. One possibility, the opposite of system justification, is total apathy. You just don't care at all. And in the political realm, that happens. People who say they'll never vote, they don't pay attention to politics, and so on. That's one way of thinking about what the opposite is. Another way is to think about revolutionaries, people who are system challenging, and the very opposite end of things. And then the scale would go from positive to negative and very, very high on both sides. The other possibility is it's kind of from zero, you kind of are low system justification. You kind of don't think things are very fair, but you're also not a revolutionary, and it goes to higher. To me, all those are really interesting questions, and maybe it's useful to think about different opposites if you're asking different kinds of questions, including questions about political participation or apathy or things like this. But to me, that's a different question a little bit of whether it's good or bad to have some. I do think we can't really do without it in some sense. And I think almost every cultural product that human beings have ever come up with, including religion, but lots of other things too, have some element of it. Because we do need to believe in some part of what we're going to do. If we're going to undertake anything collective at all, we have to buy into it on some level. So I totally agree with that. And then even to follow up, I can tell you that we now have some data. It's under review. We have a paper that's under review that's looking at curvilinear relationships of system justification. And we're finding that in terms of certain kinds of political action, participation, going to demonstrations, rallies, things that we think of as good civic participation. We're not talking about riots or something like that. We're talking about demonstrating, making your voice known, and so on. The people who tend to engage in those kinds of you might think of non-disruptive or something, or normative forms of political activity or even protest, are not super low or super high. They're intermediate. That's the maximum level of participating in this way. And I think it's because if you're super high on system justification, everything's great. There's absolutely no reason to go out in the streets whatsoever. And if you're super low on it, it's like, it doesn't matter what I do. They're not going to listen to any of us anyway. And so you need to have some belief that the system will listen to the voice in order for you to be willing to express it. Yeah. Yes, great, thanks. I'm sorry, I'm focusing on the closer, but I'm going to get to the back soon. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
Second, how well would you say some of these studies externalize? Because I think with things that are, especially politics, that have an emotional or kind of personal element to it,
Yeah.
that there's a lot of things that you have to account for.
Yeah.
And how well can you generalize that to a larger, with your study that you're doing right now?
I'm sorry, the study what?
The one about I think it was the income and the one that you were showing for the first time.
Oh, yeah, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
How well would that externalize to a larger American population, given the diversity of political opinions? And it's convenient to say kind of create a dichotomy of liberal, conservative, but there's a lot more gray area in between those two.
Oh, well, lucky for me, you picked the most nationally representative study I presented. That one, very well, because that was, first of all, we didn't pick liberals and conservatives, and we didn't dichotomize. We randomly sampled. We actually paid people it's their job to figure out how to get a representative sample of the whole country. And they got 1,500 people and showed that the demographics of those 1,500 people matched very closely the demographics of the nation as a whole. And then we asked them their opinions about all these things, including a range of political attitudes. So there's plenty of, it's a bell curve. There's lots of people in the middle, not highly, polarization, that's another story. But in general, most of these variables are normally distributed. Most people are not at a very extreme level of system justification. They're, it's a bell curve. So that's the one study, I think, where we could generalize to the population as a whole. Now, it may not generalize to the next election, because this was about the 2016 election. So there may be different candidates who raise different issues, and there might be different fault lines, or it might cut in different ways.
I think that was kind of what I was trying to do.
Okay.
It's like there's not really, like if you ask one person what liberal means versus another versus,
Yeah.
there's so many, people will give you so many different definitions of what those words mean. So even if you define them properly, like how well does it, I guess, expand to, so like it wouldn't apply to the next election, just given that things can change
Yeah.
in the political climate.
So you're channeling a classic article in Political Science right now by Phil Converse from 1962 or 64, where he made exactly that argument that most people don't even know what the terms liberal and conservative mean. They don't know what other things ought to go with it. Argued that most people, most ordinary citizens, don't have meaningful ideology in any meaningful sense. Only 10 to 15% of political sophisticates, highly educated people and professional politicians and so on, really have he argued, tightly constrained attitudes around things like liberal, conservative, or left or right. That's a huge literature. There's been 50, 60 years of people responding to Converse, including me. I wrote a whole paper about that called The End of Ideology. If you're interested in my take on it, it's in The American Psychologist in 2006. The short answer is that things have changed a lot since 1962. In that it's still the case. You're certainly right that there's lots of people out there who can't give particularly cogent definitions of these terms and particularly coherent opinions. But the people who would even who would satisfy his criteria from that time period now has gone from like 10 to 15% to over 50%, 60%. And it follows the path of increasing education in the United States. More and more people have been going to college. And also we see the media environment is way more politicized now than it was 30, 40 years ago. Things have changed. Now, I think even if they would give you somewhat different definitions, or they would have somewhat different priorities within the values of liberals and conservatives, most people now, like an overwhelming, I shouldn't say overwhelming, at least 2/3, maybe 3/4 of all American citizens can tell you whether they're liberal or conservative. Okay, yes, I promised to get to the back. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
I was wondering if you have, or if you haven't, maybe it could happen if you conducted these studies in a country where the status quo was more progressive,
Yeah.
where the system was more left-leaning.
Yes.
When you threaten the system, would they support the status quo that is more of a left-leaning status quo, or would they kind of shift towards the right?
Great. I love it. In 2009, we wrote a chapter for the annual review of psychology, and at the end of the chapter, they asked us to come up with discussion questions and things for future research, and that was one of our questions for ourselves. So I think it's a great question. Since then, we have, since I've been talking about this research, people frequently have this idea, especially about the cognitive style, epistemic, existential, relational differences, and so on. People always bring up Sweden to me about this in exactly the way that you're talking about it. Are people in Sweden, are the high system justifiers in Sweden very rigid but also very liberal? And so I finally found a collaborator in Sweden, and we did that research. And to be honest with you, I was a little bit surprised. The answer to that in Sweden is no. That in Sweden, their data look a lot like the data from the US, from Italy, from Germany, from the Netherlands, from all these other places, in that the high system justifiers are more conservative, they're more right-wing, they are more religious, and they also are higher on these epistemic, existential, and relational needs. But in the last 2 months, I think I found a place where the results go the opposite way, and it's not what I expected. It's France. We have done a nationally representative survey in France, and somehow we got the system justification questions into a nationally representative sample in France. They translated it and put it in there, and it's the first country I've ever seen out of 20 or more where system justification, the literal French translation of our system justification scale, is correlated with left-wing orientation in France. It's also correlated with lower authoritarianism. That's the first time I've seen that. And it's correlated with more tolerant attitudes toward immigrants, toward Muslims, and so on. So in France, at least, they seem to be justifying liberté, égalité, fraternité, the ideals of the left French Revolution. Yeah. Awesome, thank you. Okay, another backbencher here. Yeah.
Just seeking a little bit of semantic clarification here.
Okay.
I find your claim that the proliferation of Trump support being ironic pretty interesting. You cite how the middle-class capitalists still support Trump because he challenges the system. The irony here, of course, being that supposedly Trump is a preeminent capitalist and embodies the current system of government. However, couldn't you easily make the argument that capitalism is intrinsically anti-government since the purest form of capitalism is laissez-faire economics with zero government regulation? I guess my question in general is, how does being a capitalist in a federalist government make you a representative of the current system of government?
I agree with the last premise, which is that you can be, obviously we know, and this is kind of where economic conservatism has gone the last 30, 40 years, you can be a big fan of capitalism and a hater of government, right? Grover Norquist said we want to get size of government down to the size where we can drown it in the bathtub. There's been a major, yes, on that level, yes, but that's not what I was saying, actually. That's not what I suggested might be ironic, the conflict. It wasn't the conflict between government and capitalism. It was what I think is there's some level of irony there, and maybe you share that or you don't share that, I don't know, we can find out, but is that there were a lot of people who were trying to explain why Trump was catching on in a similar way to explaining why Bernie Sanders was catching on for a little while, which is to say that the white working class was really fed up with lower wages, economic stagnation, essentially what I would consider to be some of the consequences of what Cornel West said, the neoliberal global order, the consequences of capitalism, global capitalism in our time. I think it's true that Trump supporters, many of whom were white members, were white working class people, were very frustrated with the consequences of it, being out of work, underemployed, etc. I thought what I was trying to suggest was that at the same time as they're frustrated with the consequences of it, they don't seem to be critical of where it's coming from, which is, in fact, the global competition under capitalism as it's evolved in the last 30 years. Does that make more sense?
Oh, for sure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, here.
Is like high system justification, is that stable enough to maybe transfer to a totally contrived system that you present to people? Like, like here's something fictional or like a little scenario that either you created or it could be fictional. Like, I could see like a high system justifier like cheering on the Empire in Star Wars.
So I think you're right about Star Wars, but that's because people are heavily emotionally involved in it, not because it's fictional. And in fact, some people are so emotionally involved in it that for them it's maybe not fictional. I think I think on the original part of your question, and Phil Tetlock has raised this too, saying that shouldn't we be able to find evidence of system justification in hypothetical societies, using his hypothetical societies paradigm. I like his hypothetical societies paradigms mainly because they get at kind of questions that John Rawls was raising about what do people think is the optimal level of inequality and the optimum floor level and so on. But I don't think it's very helpful for studying system justification because I don't think people are psychologically attached to a society that they know is hypothetical. And that's why, but that's why I think they could be attached to Star Wars because it's not hypothetical, it's important. But I think what I'm talking about is a dynamic that requires some real involvement psychologically for it to happen. Yeah. Yes?
I think it makes a lot of sense when you argue that for advantaged groups. But the disadvantaged groups, I still have a hard time wrapping my head around it.
Most people do, yeah. Yeah. I've been trying for 25 years and still, yeah, people are having a hard time.
So if you are a member of an oppressed group,
Yeah.
and then you blame that oppression on your own group, that you are somehow putting yourself down or that it would be a threat to one's self-esteem. So I just wonder, how do you get around that? Or is it, and system justification just trumps, if you will, ego justification?
Okay, no, I'm not trying to say the last thing. I think for some individuals it does, but not for other individuals. So here's what I think. I think there's a dilemma that members of disadvantaged groups face between all three of these motives, between ego justification, group justification, and system justification. And ideally, one would like to feel good about all three things. You'd like to feel good about yourself, you'd like to feel good about your compatriots, and you'd like to also feel good about the national system or whatever the overarching system is that you are part of. But in a situation where you're the bottom of the totem pole, it's not so easy to do this. I think some people choose themselves, and they might even distance themselves from their group or from their community and pursue the strategy of individual exit or individual success. Other people will choose the system and defend that and criticize. We might think of very famous conservative African Americans who criticize affirmative action plans and so on, Shelby Steele or Ward Connolly or Clarence Thomas or something like these people, right? In a way, they're choosing the system over themselves or their group, and maybe they chose themselves and the system. Some other people might be choosing, no, I'm going to actually pass up the opportunities I have to fight for my group, for my community, so they might choose the group over even their own economic prospects or something, right? The point is that there's a potential conflict or dilemma among these things, and that I think it can create ambivalence and conflict. It's what W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about double consciousness, right? One feels forever a two-ness, in one body. On the one hand, you see yourself, as you want to be, as you are, and the other hand, you can't help but sometimes seeing yourself through the lens of the advantage group, the group that's oppressing, right? And I think that's what it is. I think it's because we're social beings, we're social creatures. We can't be impervious to our social value in the hierarchy or others' impressions of us, and so on. It affects us whether we want it to or not, I think. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if you have looked at minoritized population in the U.S. that would be second generation, so like maybe African second generation population?
Yeah, I had a student who was interested in that, in immigrants. We had, it wasn't super great data, it was cross-sectional, kind of correlational data, so we didn't know how much to make of it. And it was also based on several years' worth of students at NYU. So there are a lot of first generation, second generation, third generation immigrants who are students at NYU, but there's only a few every year, so we had to aggregate across many years. And what we found, let me make sure I got the result right, there was a difference. I believe the way, it might be easier if I remember our interpretation. Yes. I hope I'm getting the data right, but this is what I believe I learned from that exercise. That first generation immigrants were higher on general system justification in the United States than second and third generations were. So the idea that I had, or at least the story I was playing with about that, was that when people make a decision to come to another country, in part for economic opportunities and so on, first of all, they have a choice, and so we know from cognitive dissonance and so on, they're likely to, in some ways, justify that choice and that decision. But also, they're comparing their life here to their life in another place that they wanted to leave. And they might actually draw some favorable comparisons with the current US situation, given the place that they decided to leave. Whereas the second, third generation don't have the benefits of that other comparison, and they only know this situation where they're, in many ways, disadvantaged relative to their peers. Does that fit with were you working with a hypothesis there too?
I think, I was sort of getting at the idea, so we're talking about like global consciousness.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing is that we situate.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, it seems that anecdotally that second generation immigrant, or, you know, the children of immigrants in this country have less of the global consciousness.
Oh, I see.
Going on, but
Yeah.
there is a lot of ego justification.
Mhm.
And, you know, there's a lot of focuses in those communities. So I'm just wondering what the difference might be there.
I think you're right. There definitely is research, it's maybe analogous to research on bilinguals, where people have almost like a different self concept in one situation versus another. And it could be based on who they're interacting with, whether they're family members or people at school, or whether they're talking in one language or another. And it's been shown in social psychology to have pretty powerful effects if you prime one of those identities over another. So this is not really directly relevant maybe to system justification theory, but like there's research on Asian American women or Asian women. If you first prime their ethnicity, they do better on math tests, and if you first prime their gender, they do worse. So stereotype lift or stereotype threat, and so on. But there's other examples too. People have different thoughts when they're thinking about themselves as a member of one group versus another. Yeah. Cool, thanks. Oh, sorry. Can we keep going? Okay, last question. Sorry. I could go on for a long time now.
Your inclusion of John Gaventis' work in Appalachia,
Yeah.
your inclusion of that,
Yeah.
got me wondering, have you studied or are you intending to study cultures or subcultures who have shifted, like Appalachia has shifted from being an area where it did not engage in system justification, the largest worker revolt in American history at Mattawan, to in the Trump election defending the coal producers. So it's made a huge psychological and
Yeah.
political shift, and I don't
Yeah.
know if you've looked at that.
It's sort of beyond my capacities as a mostly experimental social psychologist. I mean, that's really a thing for cultural sociologists, for anthropologists, and so on. Although we were talking about at lunch the new book by J.D. Vance about hillbilly elegy that captures some of this in kind of a descriptive way. There's also this new book by Arlie Hochschild, the sociologist, where she's also analyzing some of these same dynamics from a more data perspective. I mean, I have thoughts and reactions to these things. One of my favorite films in the world is Matewan by John Sayles. And I find I do find what's going on in Appalachia very interesting, and that's why I picked up the book by Vance and so on, and found that quite interesting. He doesn't explain anything really, but he does a very vivid job of describing the way things are now. Yeah, I think it's a complex, in that case it has to be a complex story that about history and political mobilization, organization. I mean, there's a psychological, element to that, because it wouldn't work in some sense if it wasn't resonating, I think, with people's psychological needs and interests. So that's part of that broader enterprise is what I've been trying to do in certain fields, like in history or in political science sometimes. The assumption is that it's all kind of elite-driven, and it's sort of top-down, that it's all about political organization, it's all about media, it's all about how much money is spent to organize things and so on. And I totally think those things are very important, big part of it. But in my view, maybe as a psychologist, none of that would work unless people were in some level receptive psychologically to those messages. So I think there is a story to tell there. I don't know if I'm the best one to tell it, but thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.